I sat in the waiting room of the clinic, nervously bouncing my leg as I scrolled through the same email on my phone for the 5th time. I wasn't really reading it, I just needed something to distract myself. The truth was, I hated doctor's appointments. It wasn't that I was afraid of doctors. It was more that I didn't like facing the reality of having to take care of myself. I had neglected that for far too long. After my divorce, everything felt like it had fallen apart. A year ago, I'd been married, living in a beautiful house with a woman I'd spent 6 years with. Now I was sitting here, waiting to meet my new doctor for the first time. Everything had changed after I admitted to myself and to her that I was gay. It wasn't easy. And the guilt of hurting someone I had cared about still weighed on me. But it was the right decision. I just wish the fallout hadn't been so messy. Mr. Anderson. A nurse called from the doorway. I looked up and nodded, shoving my phone into my pocket as I stood. She led me to a small examination room and told me the doctor would be with me shortly. I sat on the edge of the exam table, nervously tapping my fingers against my leg, trying not to think about everything that had laid me here. A few minutes later, the door opened, and a man walked in. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that was just slightly tangled, as if he'd run his hands through it one too many times. He smiled warmly as he introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Dr. Green. How are you today, Mr. Anderson?" "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile as I shook his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, and I couldn't help but notice how kind his eyes were. He had that calm, confident demeanor that put people at ease. As he sat down and began reviewing my file, I found myself feeling unexpectedly comfortable around him. I hadn't expected that. In fact, I hadn't expected to feel anything other than awkward. But something about him made me relax. And before I knew it, I was telling him more than I had planned. I just got divorced. I blurted out, feeling my face flush. And, well, I'm still figuring things out. Dr. Green paused and looked up from the file, his expression softening. "I'm sorry to hear that. It must have been a difficult time for you." I nodded, biting my lip. "Yeah, it's been tough. But I mean, it was the right decision." I realized I wasn't being honest with myself or with her. I stopped, wondering why I was sharing this with a stranger, even if he was my doctor. He didn't seem fazed, though. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes focused on mine. "It's not easy to make those kinds of decisions, but it sounds like you're trying to do what's right for yourself. That's important." There was something about the way he said it, like he genuinely understood. And for the first time in months, I felt like maybe I wasn't completely lost. After we went through the usual checkup routine, Dr. Green asked if I had any questions. I hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I know this is probably too personal, but have you ever had to make a choice like that? Something that changes everything?" He smiled, and there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes, as if he knew exactly what I was talking about. "Yes, I have," he said quietly, closing my file. "I'm gay, too." I blinked, surprised at how easily he said it, and how much relief I felt hearing those words. There was no hesitation in his voice, no fear of judgment, just honesty. "I came out in medical school," he continued. "It was hard at first, but it was the best decision I ever made. Living authentically, it's not always easy, but it's worth it." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of connection to this man I had just met. "I've been trying to figure out what authentic even means," I admitted. Dr. Green chuckled softly. "It's different for everyone, but you're already on the right path, even if it doesn't feel that way." As our appointment ended, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. It wasn't just the checkup. I felt seen, understood, in a way I hadn't been for a long time. When I stood to leave, Dr. Green smiled again. "If you ever want to talk outside of these walls, I'm here," he said. "Sometimes it helps to have someone who's been through it." I thanked him, a little stunned by the offer, and left the clinic feeling lighter than I had in months. Weeks passed and I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Green. His words, his understanding. There was something about him that made me want to see him again. Not just for another checkup, but to talk. To see if maybe there was something more. I didn't have an appointment scheduled. But one evening I found myself back at the clinic, standing outside his office door, unsure of what to do. I wasn't even sure if he was still working. But just as I was about to leave, the door opened, and there he was, locking up for the night. "Mr. Anderson," he said, surprised but not unkind. "Everything okay?" Yeah," I stammered. "I was just wondering if you wanted to grab a coffee or something. I mean, not as my doctor, but just, as friends." He smiled again. That same warm smile that had put me at ease the first time we met. I'd like that. We ended up at a small cafe a few blocks from the clinic. As we sat across from each other, talking about everything from work to life after coming out, I felt something shift between us. It wasn't just the casual conversation anymore. There was something deeper, something real. At one point, I looked up and caught him staring at me. His dark hair was falling into his eyes again, and he brushed it aside with a small laugh. "What?" I asked, feeling a little self-conscious. "Nothing," he said, his smile softening. "I just think you're braver than you give yourself credit for." I swallowed, not sure how to respond to that. No one had ever called me brave before. But looking at him, I realized maybe he was right. It had taken me years to come to terms with who I was. And even though the process was still messy and painful, I was doing it. I was living it. "Thanks," I said quietly, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "I'm just trying to figure it out." He reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on mine. "We all are." That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about Dr. Green. About Mark. We had talked for hours. And as we said goodbye, there had been a moment. A pause where it felt like something more could happen. But I had hesitated, unsure if I was ready for it. The next day, he texted me. It was simple, just checking in, asking how I was doing. But it was enough. Enough to make me realize I wanted more. That I was ready to take another step, even if it scared me. A week later, I found myself standing at his door again. But this time, I wasn't nervous. When he opened the door, I smiled. And before he could say anything, I leaned in and kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, but then his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer. The kiss deepened and everything else fell away. The fear, the doubts. In that moment, it was just him and me. And it felt right.